Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rebecca Firestone, Executive Director of Open Sky Policy Institute, and we are really delighted to have you all here for our webinar, Demystifying the State Budget. When Open Skies scheduled this webinar, we did not anticipate that the budget bills would be heard in the Appropriations Committee this very afternoon, but that is really fortuitous timing. And we're grateful to all of you who are coming in to be a part of the budget process and to bring your questions to this conversation. We're also really delighted that we have two absolute experts here to walk us through the state budget setting process and to give us a little bit of an insight into what goes into building the Nebraska state budget. And so we have Keisha Patent, the Legislative Fiscal Analyst, and we have Senator Myron Dorn, who sits on the Appropriations Committee and represents Legislative District 30. I will say at the outset of this webinar that when we scheduled it at Open Sky, the full potential of the impact on federal changes to funding and what it would mean for Nebraska were not particularly evident when we were thinking to plan this webinar. And I think we are still looking to gain more information about how changes at the federal level to government funding may potentially impact the Nebraska state budget. We are watching carefully negotiations regarding Medicaid and SNAP in particular for what they may mean for Nebraska. But the focus of this webinar is really on the Nebraska state budget and the process of putting it together. Any government budget, however, whether it's at the state or the federal level, should reflect the priorities of taxpayers who contribute the funds to be able to build that budget. So our intent with this webinar is to enable the Second House, the people of Nebraska, to engage with legislators as they are thinking about building the next budget for our next biennium, which is fiscal years 26 and 27. So the focus of this webinar today is on the state of Nebraska and its budget, but we did want to acknowledge that there is some uncertainty in the overall landscape of government funding at this point in time. So a couple housekeeping matters, and then I'll get into formal introductions. We are recording this webinar, and it will be made available on Open Sky Policy Institute's YouTube channel afterwards. You can also reach out to our Outreach and Engagement Manager, Noah Rhodes, and he can send you a copy of the YouTube recording afterwards as well. If you have questions during the course of this conversation, please note the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Put your questions into that box as we are going through this conversation, and we will have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of this webinar to make sure that your questions get answered. And as a final note, we will be sending out a survey to everyone who attended this webinar. We would like to get some feedback from you about the information that Open Sky is providing and ways that we can make our materials more useful and helpful to you. So with that, I'm going to do some formal introductions of our panelists, and then we'll turn it over to them. So Senator Myron Dorn has represented Legislative District 30, which is, I believe, Adams and Gage County. Senator Dorn, if I've got that right, has served on the Appropriations Committee since 2019. Senator Dorn's experience offers him a really unique insight into the day-to-day work of crafting the state budget. And we also have Keisha Patent, Legislative Fiscal Analyst, who leads the Legislative Fiscal Office. With 12 years and a breadth of experience in the office, she provides Nebraska's legislators with objective analysis on fiscal policy, monitors the control of funds appropriated by the legislature, and provides oversight on state projects. And I have to say, we are absolutely delighted to be able to feature legislative staffers in many of the webinars that we provide at Open Sky Policy Institute, just as an acknowledgement of the tremendous expertise and commitment amongst the staff who serve in the Nebraska State Legislature. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to you, Keisha, to walk us through high level. What does the process of building the state budget look like?
Hello, everybody. Welcome today. I'm happy to talk through a little bit about how this process works and the work that we do in our office with the Appropriations Committee and with the legislature in putting together a budget. Crafting the state budget is a multi-pronged process that starts well in advance of the legislative session. So state agencies are provided with budget instructions back in July before the session started. So they received those in July of 2024 about how to put together the information that is necessary for their budget requests, and they submit those to the governor's budget office, and they are available publicly beginning September 15th of the even-numbered year before the long session starts. Our office, the Legislative Fiscal Office, and also the governor's budget office, we go through and review all of those agency budget requests and get as much information as possible relative to each individual item. I do want to kind of comment generally on how the budget works. Nebraska does not do what some people consider to be zero-based budgeting. We don't start each agency's budget from zero and add in every single expense relative to what they would need to administer programs and to do aid programs every single budget cycle. Instead, what we do is look at their current base appropriation for this year and then look at what the incremental changes are, either additions or reductions relative to those administrative costs or aid program responsibilities. So we kind of look at it in those incremental stages. So we see a net change relative to the state's appropriations levels. Agencies, as part of their budget request, though, are required to submit if they have any general fund appropriation at all. And the general fund is the main fund of the state, the main checking account where all the sales and income taxes, most of the sales taxes and income taxes go. That is a fund that's required to be balanced, and sometimes the obligations are higher than the projected revenues. And so we do require all state agencies with general fund appropriations to prepare what are called budget modifications as part of their budget request. And those are basically designed to have agencies identify what potential reductions they could make if that would be required of them to cut 5% out of their existing budget. So they usually offer a list of possible reductions if that would be necessary. So after we do all of this review, of course, the legislature convenes in January. The governor has a recommendation relative to the entire budget package, and that's kind of the starting point for the legislature. After that, the Appropriations Committee spends a lot of time, many hours, going through all of the agency budget requests and all of the items that are in the governor's recommendation that may be different or new as compared to the agency budget requests, and goes through those things item by item. And it's a very intense and time-consuming process for our office who work with the committee and also for the committee members. And they craft what's called a preliminary recommendation. And that report was released this morning. And that is kind of the starting point for the legislature's decisions about the particular budget items that the legislature's Appropriations Committee is prioritizing at this stage. Then the Appropriations Committee will undergo public hearings for the budget bills, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, and then also for each state agency. They have their own individual public hearing relative to their budget request, any additional items that have come up relative to their appropriations needs. And then there are also bills referred to the Appropriations Committee that may change funding levels for certain programs. So there will be hearings on those. And then once that is all complete, which should be about the third week of March, the Appropriations Committee will again start going through line item by line item, all of the kind of outstanding budget requests and items. Perhaps the committee members wanted more information about a particular thing, or they wanted to get some public feedback relative to those items. So they've deferred, they've waited. So the preliminary budget usually includes approval of some items, but there are a lot of items that are deferred by the committee pending the public hearings. Once that review is done after the public hearings, then they will release their final recommendation, which would go to the floor of the legislature for debate. And then, of course, there will be changes relative to amendments and the potential, once they enact a budget, to have certain line items vetoed by the governor and a discussion of any potential overrides or those sorts of things. That's much later in the process. But we're, I think, at like step 3 of 7 at this point with the state budget. And as I mentioned, as part of this, the general fund is sort of the focus of the whole budget outlook. And there is what we call the general fund financial status that's published as part of all of the Appropriations Committee reports and the budget reports. And we also publish this periodically throughout the year when, for instance, after the Economic Forecasting Advisory Board meets, and we update revenue estimates. And this, if you happen to have the link available for the preliminary report, is on page 3 of the report. And this is a fund that is required by the Constitution to be balanced, and it shows generally the estimated revenues into the general fund and the estimated obligations. So there are several lines on the status that the Appropriations Committee specifically has authority over. Their decisions will change the potential revenues in if there are transfers authorized by the committee to the general fund or out of the general fund. And it can also affect, of course, the appropriations obligations based on the decisions that they've made for the general fund appropriations. So that's kind of the starting point, the main focus. There are also various other types of funds that the budget is composed of. That includes cash funds. The state of Nebraska has many hundred different cash funds. I don't know the exact number, but it's certainly more than 300 cash funds. And some of those cash funds are always limited in terms of their revenue source and in terms of the purpose of the use. So those are very specific to what those are called and what they can be used for, what revenue goes into them. And then we also have, of course, federal funds, which Rebecca mentioned. The state does rely on federal funds for certain programs. Certain programs have matching federal funds, so that is also taken into account. And just for reference, so you know how this fits into the total, in the fiscal year 26, the first year of the preliminary budget report, about 28% of total funds appropriated are from the general fund, about 29% from cash funds, that's all cash funds together, and then about 35% from federal funds. And of course, a very large chunk of those federal funds are Medicaid related funds. So trying to think if I have anything else to add, but I think I'll stop there and turn it over to Senator Dorn.
I'm wondering, before we turn it over just to you, Senator Dorn, Keisha, you mentioned a couple technical terms that I was hoping that we might be able to just clarify for folks who aren't deep in the budget process. When you say a base appropriation, so that you start off with the agencies get a base appropriation. So that's how much money that they were appropriated in the previous biennium, is that right?
Yes. So
Okay.
all of the budgeting, the state moved to biennial budgeting, I think in the early 80s or mid 80s. And so we do a 2-year budget cycle. We do 2 fiscal years at a time. And then, so the long session of the legislature is when that biennial budget is set. And then there are adjustments in the short legislative session, which would be next year, that could adjust that. But what we use for a starting point for the next biennial budget is the last year of the current biennial budget. So that's what I mean by the base. What they have this year is the base that would be going forward for the next 2 years, absent any of these changes. So if the legislature, a program was one-time funding, then they would take that out going forward. Or if they have additional needs, then they would add more funds going forward.
Okay, great. That's really helpful. And could you give us an example of the agencies that are making these budget requests, just so we do some level setting of
Sure.
the organizations that we're talking about?
Yeah, and they do vary quite a bit, I would say.
Yeah.
I think there's 80 state agencies now, and the largest one in terms of the state budget is Department of Health and Human Services. It's a very significant portion of general funds, cash funds, and federal funds for the entire state budget. Of course, there are also other agencies that you probably have heard of, Department of Revenue, that administers a lot of aid programs and also has a lot of tax administration responsibilities. There is the University of Nebraska is a state agency for budgeting purposes. And then you have a lot of licensing boards or smaller commissions that are I don't want to say, well, maybe special purpose is the best way of saying that. License in a particular profession, for instance, there's a board of engineers and architects. There's a board of landscape architects, geologists, those kinds of licensing entities. And there are also some commodity boards, agricultural commodity boards like the Corn Board, are state agencies. So they kind of run the gamut in terms of the size of their budget and also what their purpose is.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. I just asked those questions in part to help our audience really get the full scope of the complexity of the budget decisions that you need to make with your colleagues, Senator Dorn. We're looking at 80 some state agencies that go through this budgeting process, over 300 cash funds, as well as trying to balance the general fund. So with that, Senator Dorn, why don't we turn it over to you and give us some insight into where we're at coming into this particular budget cycle. I know lots of folks may have seen on the news that we're coming into this session with a budget shortfall. And I know it's top of mind for a number of legislators. So where are we at, and what are the things that you're balancing in your work on the Appropriations Committee?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Keisha mentioned that the preliminary budget was put out this morning, and you can go on the website, the legislature website, and look all that up, and it will go through all the pages. But right away on page number 1, and this shows how we came about to, I call it, where we're at in the point in time with the forecasting board putting out their numbers that we were 432 negative or in the hole. And it 291 million in general fund revenue forecast. So that number I hadn't seen before until this morning. So we don't look at, I call it those individually or whatever, but that explains why we got to the point we are. And now as we work through the budget process, and this is the preliminary budget, so we have gone through every agency and every program. There's 270 or 80 programs inside those 80 agencies. We don't, Keisha, the fiscal office, nobody, unless they do it mentally, they don't do it a longhand. A number where we're at, this is the first time we knew kind of where we're at after the preliminary budget, so that as we look at all the agencies and all the programs, we don't get down to the end 5 or 6 and say, uh-oh, we have to still have $5 or $10 million out, and then we just cut those. We look at every agency on their own. So as we go through this first time through the budget process, we don't get a final number until we're done with this preliminary budget process. This is put out now. We haven't had any agency hearings, we have 40 bills. We haven't had any of those bills. And those bills will line up with their agency generally when we have the hearings. So that's what Keisha said is going between now and towards almost the end of March. So that is, we won't, I call it, evaluate any of these until we get done. The forecasting board, they came out and had one in October. Now they'll have one here February 28th. That will change, or could change where that, I call it, that ending number is at. They will give us a new revenue forecast. We will put out the budget mostly on that forecast. However, they also will have a forecast now in the end of April, the last couple of days of April. The budget on day 70 has to be to the floor, which is May 5th. So somewhere in there or on the floor, we will have the discussion on that ending April number. That will be what the overall budget for the state will be, what the number we will use to make that final budget. So if we have increased revenue or decreased revenue, or this preliminary budget showed us at about 260 million deficit yet. However, there are many things that we didn't include in this preliminary budget that we kind of passed over or waited on. Kind of a lot of the things we did, or some of the things we did, is I call it, we had discussion quite often if there were bills brought forward for funding or for, I call it, taking programs back or whatever that were in other committees. We didn't act on those because we didn't want the Appropriations Committee to say that they took that in or didn't take that in. We want that bill to have its process in whatever committee it's in. Many of those are in the Revenue Committee. So like I said, day 70 will be out to the legislature, out to the floor. We have 10 working days to complete the budget. This is the one bill that generally the Speaker Arch, will make as a super priority. That means he can schedule it. He can schedule the amendments how he wants to schedule the amendments, and he can also schedule the time of the debate on each of those amendments, so that we don't get bogged down for 8 hours on just one particular thing, that as we have all those amendments, that we can have many of those discussions or whatever. So day 80 is when the budget's supposed to be passed. If we don't do anything else this year up here in Lincoln, the one thing we are required to do is have a budget passed. And the other thing is it has to be a balanced budget. So Keisha talked a little bit about that, where we have a balanced budget and how we come about that. But that is the one thing that the legislature is required to do, is to complete that budget process and have a balanced budget. So we'll have a lot of discussion on things between now and then. The next 30 days, basically, for Appropriations Committee, it's having the agencies in. I know there were many of them, particularly Health and Human Services, but others also that we had a lot of questions on. We didn't understand maybe why they were asking for this funding or that funding or this appropriations. They will get to come in and we'll get to ask them questions. And they also many of them have been apprised of why we did or why we didn't do certain things. So they will be able to come in and have those discussions. So with that, the 40 bills will also be heard in the next several weeks. So with that, we hope to get to the process to day 70 and have a budget bill to the floor.
Thanks so much, Senator Dorn. That's really helpful in terms of working us through the process. And I think what I'm hearing from both of you is a message that we are still pretty early in the process of setting the budget for the next 2 fiscal years. And there's a number of key steps that need to occur going through the legislative session this year. One of them is all of the hearings on bills in the Appropriations Committee over the next 30 days or so, but then also the forecasting board. So just to take a moment to make sure that for those outside of the Capitol bubble understand what the forecasting board is and when it meets. I'm wondering, Keisha, since I know you do some engagement with the forecasting board, could you just give us a quick recap of what it is, when they meet, what they look at?
Sure. Every state has some sort of forecasting mechanism, and what Nebraska has is an independent board that has 9 members. 5 are appointed by the legislature and 4 are appointed by the governor, and they meet 2 or 3 times a year. In a long session, they do meet 3 times. They met in October, as Senator Dorn said, and then they'll meet again the end of this month and in April. And next year they will, well, later this calendar year, they will meet again in October and then next February. And they set consensus forecast that is used by both the legislature and the governor's office for the current fiscal year and the upcoming biennial budget fiscal years. So they set a forecast in October for fiscal year 25, the current fiscal year. They revised that forecast and set the official forecast for the first time for fiscal year 26 and 27. And what the governor's office and the legislature both use in crafting budget recommendations is they budget to that consensus forecast. So relative to any changes that the forecast board makes about projected net receipts and sales tax, income tax, corporate income tax, or miscellaneous tax, then would affect that final number relative to that fiscal year's forecast. And then the legislature and governor, of course, would have an opportunity to make adjustments as needed if revenue goes up or if revenue goes down in that forecast after the board meets.
Thanks. That's really helpful. And for those of you following along on this webinar, Open Sky spends a fair amount of time tracking the forecasting board. And so you can follow our socials around the time when the forecasting board meets to get some more information about it. I think we're looking at the February 28th, I believe, is in
It is,
the
yes,
board,
at
the
10
next,
o'clock in the morning.
yeah,
Mhm.
10 o'clock in the morning. So, so some important numbers that are going to be coming out of this particular forecasting board. Senator Dorn, is there anything that you want to add on about economic forecasting?
I think he should explain that very well.
Yeah.
We do, like I said, as we bring our budget to the floor, generally, we're looking at the February 28th numbers. So it'll be, for us, it will be looking at how did they leave those numbers? Did they leave them the same? Did we get increased revenue or did we get decreased revenue? And then what that, I call it that ending number will be, so that we kind of have a number then what we can bring, I call it the budget, the proposed budget to the floor, because we're not going to be 100 million or 200 million off of that. I call it ending number on the fiscal status report. We're going to be pretty close to that. In previous years, since I've been here, we would always have a certain amount of money left, what I'd call, if we had a balanced budget, we were bringing to the floor, that left 100 million maybe in the forecast for bills on the floor, or 200 or 300 million, then that was how we acted or knew what some of those bills on the floor. If they have an appropriations with them, they can pass on general file and select file, but they cannot be passed on final until after the budget's done. So once the budget's done, we'll know if there's money left for bills on the floor or not. If there's no money left, or if we're in a place where we have a bunch, then that's how some bills will flow through. Keisha then, or the fiscal staff, every day on the floor, we get an updated fiscal status based on our budget, and then based on the bills that are up there are for discussion and such. So we get to watch all of that and see, so that, and when we get done with the 90-day session, that we will still have a balanced budget.
Thanks, Senator Dorn. That's really helpful. Keisha, I'm wondering if you could just talk us through what the major sources of funding are for the Nebraska state budget. So I think you had mentioned across the general fund and the cash funds. You had mentioned that for the total amount of the state budget, about 35% of it is federal funds. So then that means that the remainder is coming from funds gathered within the state of Nebraska. If you can talk about those main sources.
Yeah, so the general fund has two main sources, the sales tax and income tax. And of course, in income tax, there's individual income tax and corporate income tax, which are both forecasted separately by the Forecast Advisory Board. And then sales tax is also forecasted separately. There's a fourth category that does not account for very much general fund revenue, but it does account for some general fund revenue. It's I believe it's less than 5%. I would have to go back and look at the exact number, but it's just called miscellaneous tax revenue. And it does include a handful of excise taxes, like tax on alcoholic beverages, the excise tax, cigarette tax, insurance premium tax, and it transfers into the general fund are counted as a miscellaneous tax receipt as well. There's also a handful of fees that go to the general fund, but not very many. So that is generally the source of revenue for the general fund. Cash funds, as I mentioned, are very specific. They each have a dedicated revenue source in statute. They're created in statute, and it specifies where their money comes from. And in most cases, it is a fee-related revenue source. For instance, I mentioned the licensing boards earlier. When they are regulating an industry, they charge fees for applications for licenses, renewals, those sorts of things. And so they collect those fees in a cash fund, and then they can use those cash funds to administer the program that they need to administer, or in enforcement of their licensing statute. So that's a fairly common cash fund revenue source. There are also a handful of excise taxes that go to cash funds. For instance, the documentary stamp tax, which it's based on sales of real estate and the value of real estate that's sold. And there's a fee that then is, or I'm sorry, a tax that is credited to certain cash funds. There are sometimes surcharges on services that are collected by an agency and credited to a cash fund. We do also sometimes in the state budget transfer money from the general fund or the cash reserve fund, which is the state's kind of savings account, into another cash fund for a specific purpose. For instance, the property tax credit that was created in the special session for school districts, that is funded, that runs through a cash fund that's administered by the Department of Revenue, and it's funded by a transfer of money from the general fund. So that is its dedicated revenue sources is from the general fund.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Senator Dorn, I'm wondering if we can ask you a question next, which is how best can Nebraskans offer input on what they would like to see in the state budget?
Well, when we have our agency hearings and when we have the bills coming forward, they can give online comments, they can come and testify. Also, as they look at the preliminary budget here now, and I want to make sure that people understand this is very preliminary. There's a lot of things that we didn't include, or when we passed over and we wanted more information. We are getting a lot of emails on some of the things that we, I call it, left out or put in, and some of those things. So the people are very good at giving us feedback. Talked to another one of we have 3 first-time senators on appropriations. Talked to one of them this morning, and he said, "My gosh," he said, "you're a popular." He was referring to himself. He says, "You're a popular guy at this time of the legislative session because everybody wants to visit with you about what's been included or not included, or look at a certain bill or a certain fund that they would like to have appropriated." So we get a lot of feedback. We are very much, I call it, still in the process of making the puzzle, though. So it's a long way away. We will look at all these things again later. And some things we will still have to put in there. It depends on where the fiscal number comes at, whether we have to make more cuts or whether we now are more comfortable with where we're at and we can bring a balanced budget to the floor.
Thanks, Senator Dorn. So I'm hearing that the hearings that are going to be scheduled are a good way for the people of Nebraska to share their input based on the specific topic of that hearing. So that hearing schedule is on the website of the Nebraska Legislature, and you can go to the calendar of the Nebraska Legislature to find out when hearings are scheduled, submit a letter through the comment box, or come testify in person if you are so moved to comment on the topic of that particular hearing. But also, Senator, I imagine just getting in touch with your own senator is a good way to share your perspective.
One thing I want to bring up, and Keisha remembers which room number we're normally in. I call it 1013 or no 1003, which is on the north hallway here in the Capitol. That's a pretty small hearing room. We will have certain days we're in there for hearings, but check when you come. If you're going to come testify, there are generally 2 days a week now where we'll get one of the bigger hearing rooms, 15, 24, 25 and stuff, which have, I call it, a lot more seating, a lot more room. So sometimes they need to make sure where we're at for each day.
Okay, sounds good. Also, that preliminary report, which was just published this morning, I think on the Open Sky end, we'll look to make sure when we push out materials about this webinar that we'll include a link to that report so it's easy for folks to access it. And I guess would encourage people following along at home to take a look at that report, but in particular, the general fund financial status, which is a lot of numbers, but is a really good snapshot on where we're at with the budget, is a good place to start in terms of understanding all of the budget considerations that you have to make, Senator Dorn. Is that fair?
Yes, that's very good. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. All right, that's fantastic. I've got one more sort of pre-prepared question for both of you, and then we will turn it over to audience questions. We've had a number come in so far, and if you are listening in, our participants would encourage you to keep getting your questions in so we can make sure that they get answered by either Senator Dorn or Keisha. So to both of you, what is one or two things that you would hope that Nebraskans could understand about the Nebraska state budget and the budget process that maybe is not regularly conveyed.
Would you like me to go first?
No.
Um, Well, I will say in general, it's a complicated process. It's a lengthy process, and the end result is a budget bill. Like Senator Dorn said, the budget bill has to be passed by the legislature, and part of the reason for that is because our current biennial budget, it becomes null and void at the end of this fiscal year. So if the legislature doesn't act, there is no state funding for any agency or program on July 1st. So that's why the legislature has to pass a budget of some kind by the end of this session. And I think sometimes the bills are not particularly intuitive to understand what it means or what's in there and what's not in there. And so we try in our office to provide as much additional documentation as possible in terms of these reports, the preliminary report. There will be another report when the committee makes their final recommendation. And then we also do a report at the end of the legislative session based on the enacted budget that would include everything that happened on the floor of the legislature, vetoes, overrides, et cetera. So we try to provide this additional information. And I do encourage you to take a look at those and try to understand all of the different components. But this really is a long process that the legislature goes through, and it's a balancing act. There are a lot of different components. Obviously, there's on the revenue side, the forecast board is involved, and legislation and other committees, and a lot of complexity in the general fund appropriations as well. But the general fund financial status is supposed to be kind of a snapshot of like, here's what we are planning to bring in, here's what we're planning in terms of obligations to pay out. And the bottom line is in a box for everybody to see, our revenues exceeding our estimated obligations at this point. So that is useful to take a look at and try to go through the additional documentation to understand what all goes into that one-page snapshot of what is happening.
That's really helpful.
Yeah, I would just like to speak up and say, our fiscal office, the legislature, Keisha is in charge of our fiscal office. She manages the fiscal office. I believe we have 9 or 10 other people in there in the fiscal office that they are each responsible for certain agencies. Some of them some of the bigger ones like Health and Human Services. Some of them have about 10 or 12 agencies. So they each have different ones. As we're going through each of these agencies, they're sitting there with Keisha. We can ask them questions, and quite often we'll have questions that they will go in and get a hold of the agency and find out things too. So really want to thank them. I don't know if enough people realize what all goes on behind the scenes for making up the budget or whatever. The one other thing is the budget is the one thing that, and we haven't brought it up today yet, but the governor can line item veto. So when we make up this budget and all these things, and we have the governor's so-called bills today up that are introduced on behalf of the governor, these are some of his proposals, some of our proposals. The governor, though, when he comes and looks at the budget that we do pass, he has the authority on this one. He can line item certain lines in there, or he can pass the whole bill. He can sign it and have the whole thing, which last year we did. The first year Governor Pillen was here, I think there were 7 things that we attempted overrides on, and were only successful on 1. So it's a whole process of us, the governor working together, the fiscal staff working together, everybody working together to get, I call it a balanced budget at the end of the year.
Thanks, Senator Dorn. One question that we've had from the audience is if you can just remind us the timing of a fiscal year for the state of Nebraska. When does it start? When does it end?
Sure. It starts on July 1st of every year and ends on June 30th of the next calendar year. So right now we're in fiscal year 24-25, and it'll end on June 30th.
Great. And so the biennial budget that the legislature is going to be working on this year starts on July 1 of this year, and then it goes to June 30th of 2027.
2027, yes.
2027.
And
Okay.
the legislature, I mean, one thing I think that is important to recognize too with a biennial budget, but a legislature that meets every year, is that there is always opportunity to make adjustments if it's necessary. So for instance, we're in currently the biennial budget has already been enacted. It was enacted back in 2023. There were adjustments made in 2024 session and in the 2024 special session, but there are also what are called deficits, which are in LB 260 that affect this current fiscal year in this current biennium, that were additional things that were brought by agencies, additional needs that they had. So there are opportunities along the way to make adjustments if new information comes up, if there are changes relative to federal funds. I know that's a concern for some people, but so beginning our next biennial budget will be for July 1st, 2025 through June 30th, 2027. But there would still be an opportunity to make changes in the 2026 legislative session and for that second year in the 2027 legislative session. So that does help accommodate change circumstances or new information relative to what is happening with aid agency needs in terms of operations, but also with aid programs.
Thanks. If we can just sort of dig on this for a little bit, because there have been some audience questions that have come in around federal funding. I understand that there's a lot of unknowns at the federal level right now, and that we need to wait and see and sort of track carefully. But if there is a significant shift in the federal budget that might occur, with congressional budget writers, Keisha, I understand that from what you were saying with the timing of how the Nebraska legislature works is that there should be the opportunity in like the next legislative session to be able to make adjustments to the Nebraska budget following on whatever action is taken by Congress this year. Is that
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. I mean,
okay?
obviously it's something we're monitoring closely, but it's sort of changing daily in terms of what might be included in the federal budget, what might not be. I was on a different webinar on Friday where they talked about the House Budget Committee's markup of a bill for it would be federal fiscal year 26. So that would begin October 1st of 2025, and talking about some of the potential changes in there. And if they affect, for instance, Medicaid is a good example because the federal funds are a matching fund amount that's based on a set percentage for your state. And so if that is changed in any way, the state obligations, it's like a one-to-one shift in state obligations for Medicaid coverage. So if that were to begin in October, then potentially in the 2027 session, we would still be within that same fiscal year, and the state could make adjustments if necessary to accommodate the changes in the federal law. Now, it may be slightly different depending upon the program, but there is an opportunity to look at it in the 2026 session too.
Thanks. Senator Dorn, anything you want to add on from where you sit in terms of how the Appropriations Committee might be managing some of uncertainty with other government agencies?
What Keisha just had to say there. We've had some discussions in appropriations about how will this affect us or won't it affect us for the state of Nebraska. Some of these things, it's way too early to look at. We don't know for sure how they are going to ultimately shake out or what's going to be the ultimate outcome of some of these. And there is very much a chance. And if there is something looked at, I call it a lot closer, it's probably going to be next year during the session next year, once we know what actually happens or what is the result of it. So some of these things we're getting a lot of feedback from constituents and from people around the state from what's happening so far. A lot of concern out there.
Yeah. A question we got from the audience was if you can speak a little bit to how we got to a place of a budget shortfall coming into this session.
Well,
Sure.
yeah, it would.
Oh,
Oh,
go ahead.
Keisha, go ahead. No, Keisha understands it more than I do. Yeah.
I was just gonna, our office publishes a report, so we publish, of course, we had the special session in 2024 that happened in August. There was a published financial status at the end of that session. It showed for this upcoming biennium, fiscal year 26 and 27, that we had $56 million surplus at that time, based on the revenue estimates, based on the state's obligations for spending, for this upcoming biennium. And what changed, between then and now is the forecast board met in October and lowered the revenue forecast for all three of those fiscal years, 24, 25, 25, 26, and 26, 27. They set them lower than what our original estimates had been. And so that was a $291 million reduction in funds available. And then our office publishes a report after that forecast board meeting that goes through the general fund financial status, and going into the budget, the beginning of a budget cycle, we do estimates based on what agencies have actually requested for deficit appropriations and for their biennial budgets. In their budget request process, we put together estimates of things that are sort of looked at as ongoing obligations, like aid programs that have specific statutory requirements, general bargained increases in salary and health insurance for state employees, retirement obligations for the state's contribution for retirement for state employees, those sorts of obligations. And so that estimate, both the deficit estimate and the estimate for the upcoming biennium appropriation level were higher than what had been previously estimated too. So that ended up with this $432 million shortfall. And what the committee has done now is there has been no change yet to the revenue forecast. They meet the end of the month, but they have specifically approved certain appropriations items. So on our status now, we show what the committee's actually approved instead of our previous estimates of what might be required for state appropriations from the general fund. So at this, under the preliminary budget report right now, with all of the decisions that the committee has made so far, the shortfall is $261.9 million. As opposed to the 432 million. So they have gained some ground in terms of transferring money into the general fund and also lowering appropriations levels.
Just add something to that. Yeah, Keisha did a very good job of explaining that on the preliminary budget, which you're going to include on your website. So a link to that. Page 1 explains basically all of that, what kind of happened. It lists 3 or 4 things there, and it gives more detail in why we're at where we're at or whatever and stuff. One more quick comment. As we get the budget to the floor, particularly when we pass the budget, there will be a green sheet. I always call it a green sheet. That's the color they put out or whatever. It will contain our fiscal status or whatever. It will on there have a breakdown of what we did the day before, if we passed certain things, or if we didn't pass certain things. It will include that in there. So we know where we sit at. I call it an ending number as far as a balanced budget. So that's very, very helpful. That's updated daily. I think, Keisha, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can look on the state's website and look at that every day for an updated current version.
Yeah, that starts on day 70 of the legislature when the Appropriations Committee recommendation is officially published. So we'll update the report for their final recommendation approximately, well, day 70, probably not ahead of time. But then, like Senator Dorn said, daily, there will be an update to the general fund financial status based on actions of the legislature relative to the budget bills and also any other legislation that has been in other standing committees.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Keisha. Thank you so much, Senator Dorn. We are actually a little bit over time, so we're going to wrap this up just with with an enormous appreciation for your expertise and your insight. And Open Sky will continue to make opportunities for those of us watching at home to be able to follow along with this process. There is more to come through budget hearings in the month of May. We should be looking out for day 70 of the legislature, which is in the beginning of May, to see how the legislature makes sense of the budget at that point in time. Please keep following Open Sky, our website, and our social media channels. So we will do the best we can can to help it easy for folks to follow along at home with these very important decisions. So thank you so much for your time, and please, we'd encourage you to fill out our survey afterwards so that we can get some input from you on how to improve our programming. Thank you again. Have a great afternoon.